Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for your patience while we had some questions and answers in relation to the confidential items on this evening's agenda. 11.1 and 11.2 have now been dealt with in terms of questions. So we will move to item 8.6, which was raised this evening by a member of the public gallery, and that is the information bulletin. Questions were specifically asked in relation to a matter before the JDAP, which was 135 to 139 Lake Street, Perth. So perhaps, Director, if we could go to that item first. There were some questions. Can you just advise the status of that application?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, the application's been was gone up for community consultation, and that's closed. The responsible authority report is due at the start of April. At this stage, so and we'd be more than happy to facilitate a meeting between council members that aren't on the JDAP, as well as administration and the residents, to have a discussion about the proposal and answer any questions and help them understand the process around the JDAP consideration of the proposal.
Thank you, Director. How many submissions were received?
I don't have that number off the top of my head.
Okay.
No.
All right. Sounds like there's a lot of interest. Okay. Any other questions in relation to the information bulletin? Okay. No questions. Okay, then we'll move to item 5.4 and continue to move through sequentially, because we have now dealt with all items raised by members of the public and confidential items, or items where staff were waiting patiently to go home. Unfortunately, you're stuck here, managers and directors. I don't know about you a bit though. You think your work is done here this evening. Item 5.4. Oh, Verge Valet. Or perhaps we could go to that one. Okay, we will give consideration to the fact that our benchmarking does show considerable overtime. So we'll go to item 6.3, which is the waste strategy project, 2 bulk hard waste options appraisal update on Verge Valet Vincent trial, a proposal to extend for a further 6 months. Are the questions on this item? Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Why do we need to extend the trial? Why can't we just go permanent?
We certainly could go straight to full time. However, the intention is to go out to public consultation to get feedback. The feedback from the users of the scheme has been excellent, and not an issue. But obviously, that's only the participants. It's not the rest of the community. So that was my main reason for not proposing we go ahead with the scheme. Additionally, there are subcontractor is changing next year, so I wanted to ensure that there's a consistency in service and we're going to get the same high level of service going forward.
Okay, I'm just wondering if that couldn't be achieved with a different approach of consulting on a move to a permanent adoption of the service. Just from a process point of view, would that be more efficient to... Yeah, what's going to happen if we go to a trial? We'll then still have to come back with consultation. There's no consultation in the recommendation. I mean, given that the feedback so far has been very positive.
Yep.
It's just a question around whether we need to add these extra steps.
Can I just say though, if you're going to consult, you're going to have to report back in any case. So whether it's a trial and you do consultation, you report back, or whether you say go permanent and you do consultation, you report back.
So perhaps we could build some consultation into this recommendation so that at the end of 12 months, we only come back once more and say yes or no.
Yes. Sorry, through you, Chair. Yes.
That is a very good point, because I think it would be useful to have something noted in the recommendation around the consultation. If that's possible. Councillors, any questions on Verge Valet? Councillor Gontaszewski.
Thank you. I'm just having iPad difficulties, so if I've missed anything in the report about this, just note that there were a few people that raised some concerns about Verge Valley, and in some ways it seemed to be that they were more suggesting some improvements. And I wondered around people that had talked about wanting to have a bit more space, whether there would be capacity within the system to, like say, if you hadn't had a Verge Valley in the previous year, whether you might get 5 square metres versus if every year you get 3. I'm just thinking you'd still potentially see a reduction in the overall allowance that someone might get. I was just wondering if there'd been any consideration to minor tweaks to what was being offered in response to any of the negative feedback. Well, not negative, the service improvement suggestions is what I'd probably term them.
Through you, Michael. I think personally, I think it's going against what we're trying to achieve with the waste strategy. We're looking to reduce waste that's been generated. All the other schemes that I've worked on in the past, we have a cut-off, you use your allocation in the year, you can't carry that forward. There may be someone that doesn't use it for 3 years, but then we don't want to have a massive bill and not be able to budget and account for that if everyone's using it in that year. So my preference would be to you have your allocation. If you don't use it, then you're doing the right thing. You're finding some other way of minimising your waste and finding an alternate use for it, or the buy nothing pages or whatever. And we do push that really heavily at the front end too.
Councillors, Councillor Hallett.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. There was a comment in there that the projected cost is 42 grand over. And just wondering where admin's going to cover that from.
There will be, close to you, Chair, there will be some savings in landfill this year because of budgeting. That's not, obviously I couldn't foresee what was going to happen with the new trial. But there's certainly savings in landfill that will offset that.
Councillors, any further questions on the Verge Valley extension of trial? Okay, thank you very much, Manager.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me proceed.
Okay, we'll retry 5.4, advertising of amended policy number 7.7.1, non-residential development parking requirements and payment of cash in lieu of parking plan. Sorry, I added cash in there that actually wasn't in the title. Councillor Gontaszewski.
Thank you. So sorry, I'm not going to try and open it. I just wondered in relation to the hold on. In terms of the policy, there was some wording in relation to the objectives that sort of talks about to ensure suitable parking is provided for non-residential development which meets the needs of its users, is appropriate for its location and does not detrimentally impact the surrounding area. Just wondering whether it could be worth including reference to, I guess, in particular residential areas. This will relate to my next question. Just to ensure that the surrounding area, it makes it clear potentially that it is the commercial parking areas that are on street that would be preferred for parking, not parking on surrounding residential streets.
Through you, Mayor Cole, the objectives were reworded to have a more flexible approach so that the surrounding context would be considered. Just noting that that surrounding context really is around like the transportation, and that would be different in different residential areas. So that's why we weren't specific about those types of areas, so that we could do a case-by-case basis and really look at that surrounding context itself.
But if council wanted to make it clear to administration that the decision-making around the objectives of the policy would be to prioritise the maintenance of residential street parking over, then that would possibly be somewhere you could put some words in to make that clear.
Cole, yes, absolutely. We could change that so that the on-flow impact would be minimal.
And the other question I had was just around the parking management plan. I think when this has been discussed previously in a workshop environment, and I actually don't know if it was this specific policy or a discussion about developments, there was some questions asked around looking at how we consider non-residential parking, where a parking management plan or a parking study essentially puts forward on-street, non-paid bays in residential streets as being the reason why a business would not need to pay cash in lieu or not need to actually provide parking on site. And I felt, no, not saying any statements, under the public parking facilities section of the non-residential parking local planning policy, the parking plan, it notes that the question is, are there any public parking facilities on street or car parks in the vicinity of the site? Just wondering if if it's intended that those public parking facilities would effectively include local streets as well as paid or streets within a commercial zone.
Through you, Mayor Cole, it would consider, I suppose, all of those things, the other methods of transportation. But if we're just looking at parking, it would be just noting that that would require the parking management plan, and that would need to outline all of those other methods of transportation. And then it would also have to outline, where that other existing parking options are in that area to show that the parking is not required on the site.
I'll just foreshadow. I possibly have some words that I will think of over the next week, just in relation to making it clear around where the burden of non-residential parking should fall if a development is seeking not to provide parking on the site or seek to have a parking payment cash in lieu plan rather than providing parking.
Okay, so we'll expect a form of words from you during the week. Okay, Councillor Gontaszewski, thank you. Any other questions on the policy? Okay, thank you. We'll move to item 5.5, minor amendment to Metropolitan Region Scheme, Leederville Parade Primary Regional Road Reserve. Any questions? Manager, I just had one question, and I think that there is provision. I just wanted to double check that if we do remove the road, this section, seek to have the removal of this section of road reserve, do we still have sufficient space within the road reservation that's there that would be remaining to create median and landscape down the middle of the street? Because I think that was the plan that was postponed.
I can answer that through you, Mayor Cole. The principal shared path project, which the state government is working on at the moment, does move closer to Leederville Parade, the principal shared path, and has actually reduced the amount of space that was available for our project, which was putting the median in with the trees. So that the two projects kind of conflict with each other. So I think it probably would reduce the ability for us to deliver that project because of the principal shared path. We would have to eat into the car park land, expand the existing road reserve, the actual road area to make that work, which is not what we have been proposing to do. We propose to modify our project, potentially have the principal shared path move in the longer term, so that we can achieve all of those outcomes. But there's just not enough space for everything to fit in there.
Okay, so given that we have discussed that this could become the major connecting external route around Leederville, given that we've also had an MRS amendment at the intersection where the Luna is, do you think that this in any way prevents that from happening?
Through Mayor Cole, we don't think it would, because there is enough space. It's just about the principal shared path having to move into the area where the trees currently are between the freeway and where Leederville Parade Road actually starts at the moment. So there's plenty of space. It's just there are huge trees there at the moment, and we're trying to avoid those for the time being.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, councillor Iapolo?
Thanks, Mayor. Can you just give us an indication as to what the incremental value, in terms of the value of the land that we may be seeking to sell here? What does this change? How does that change the value of the value of the land to which may be sold?
Through Mayor Cole, we can take that on notice and have a look at the value of that land. We haven't got a valuation at the moment though that separates out that portion. The valuations that we have, I don't even think they considered that the principal shared path, that the primary regional road reservation was sat over that land. I think they assumed that it wasn't there. So we'd have to get another valuation, and we won't be able to do that before next week.
So I know that there was another valuation that was being done, it was discussed. So you're saying that the scope of this potential change wasn't considered for the purposes of getting the new valuation?
Yes, through Mayor Cole, this was all considered as part of request for new valuation, but we haven't received that valuation yet. So we're trying to leave that valuation until the closest date to council considering the request for proposal, so that we have an up-to-date valuation that's not, it's not old, basically.
Last question. So assuming council supports this, in relation to recommendation 2, what's the timing for the for the WAPC to actually consider that request?
Through you, Mayor Cole, they would have to conduct their own consultation on this. So it would depend on how much, similar to when we do consultation, how much consultation they get back and those types of comments. So we wouldn't be able to have a time frame on exactly how long that would take. These things really do range in how long they take. So I wouldn't want to say.
Through Mayor Cole, just to comment on that, the MRS amendment for the reduction of the road reserve on the corner of Oxford Street and Vincent was the fastest MRS amendment ever approved by the Planning Commission. That was done in about 3 or 4 months, I think. Usually the Planning Commission would quote up to 2 years for an MRS amendment, but given this is quite simple and straightforward, we'd be hoping it's much closer to the record time they took for the last time we made a similar request.
And sometimes minor amendments get wrapped up in omnibus MRS amendments, where there'll be a number of small fragments of land that are captured and put through to the WAPC as omnibus MRS amendments. So that can also be helpful. Any other questions on this item? Okay, thank you. Item 5.6, amendment to the trees of significance inventory to include the jacaranda tree at 59 Ellesmere Street, Mount Hawthorn. Any questions? Councillor Loden?
Concern was raised with me by a resident that around how you go about pruning the tree if the tree is going over their boundary fence. And so I was hoping just to get some guidance on, do they need to make a development application to prune a tree? And if not, what's their process?
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, if this does go on the inventory, then there will have to be the approval for pruning. It's to ensure that it's undertaken in the correct manner, because as the arborist report demonstrates, this is a significant tree. So it does need that approval to ensure that that is conducted and this tree maintains its significance. Having said that, we do have a fund that can be given out to assist with the pruning of our significant trees. So it would be encouraging the property owner of this tree to utilise that so that the pruning can be done, cannot impact the other neighbours, and can be done to ensure that the significance of this tree is maintained.
And in the scenario where it's overhanging a boundary fence, who bears the cost of the application, arborist report and so forth for the pruning?
Through you, Mayor Cole, it has been the applicant of where the tree is situated that has paid for the arborist report, and the pruning would be their responsibility to then apply for that funding.
And if the neighbour believes it needs to be pruned, but the owner does not, what do you do in that situation?
Through you, Mayor Cole, they could still request the funding for the pruning, but they would just have to ensure that it is done in the same way as the arborist report that is the owner owns that report. But as long as the pruning is done in line with that, they can request the funds to enact that earlier if they feel like it needs to be done earlier.
And if is there a gap in cost between what it costs to prune the tree versus what the funds are that are provided?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's a case by case situation.
Councillors, Councillor Oplow.
Just for my understanding, so when someone does do this application like this person has done, does that mean they can never remove the tree? Is it something like a equivalent to a heritage thing that they can never touch it, or do they need approval from City of Vincent to do anything with it?
Through you, Mayor Cole, they require approval. So it can be removed, and there are, within the policy reasons why it would be removed. For instance, if it no longer is significant due to the arborist report, but they would need that approval to prove that.
And does that obligation continue to if that property was sold? That same condition applies to the new owners?
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct.
Councillors, any further questions? No, okay. Item 5.7, Community Sporting and Recreation Facilities Fund and Club Nights Lights Program, February Small Grants Round application, seeking Council's approval to apply for 3 grants. Any questions? Okay. And just noting that Councillor Warner has left the meeting this evening, so it's great to have her here in attendance online. Item 6.2, RFT IE 190 of 2022, North Perth Town Hall Toilet and Kitchen Renewal. Any questions? Manager of Assets has popped up, but looks like we don't have any questions for you. Councillor Loden's not in the room. Councillor Loden, we're asking about a tender. Did you have any questions in relation to the North Perth Town Hall Toilet and Kitchen Renewal tender? Yes.
Only one tender response? We couldn't get any more than one?
Yes, we actually had 13 contractors show up to the mandatory site briefing, but only one chose to submit a tender.
So I thought through our contracting process, we were supposed to get at least 3 tenderers. I guess, is this part of a challenge of COVID and so forth, or is there an alternative? I guess probably don't want to go out to the market again, given that happened, but.
Yeah, I think the process was fair and equitable. So the respondents obviously chose, well, the people that came to the mandatory site briefing may have chose not to submit a tender based on timelines or their own capacity of works.
And my understanding is this has come within the expected budget, because we're not asking for additional funds, so it's not like we're getting gouged.
No, so it's actually come in under the North Perth Town Hall and the Lesser Hall combined budgets are at 296, and the tender submission is coming in at 247.
Councillors, Councillor Oplow.
Just to add on to a question that was asked just now, I did recently review. Sorry, I thought it was compulsory that you needed at that level of spend, you needed 3 quotes if it wasn't from an approved tenderer, or 2 if it was a pre-approved tenderer. So I'm just trying to understand how that actually works. I wasn't clear from the responses from that last question.
Just to clarify, so it went to open tender. So we weren't seeking quotes. We went to an open tender. So we didn't ask 3 providers for 3 quotes under a threshold. We were going to an open tender, which means anyone could respond. And if we receive one response, then we assess that against the criteria.
I'll probably come back with more questions next week.
Yeah, just to add and clarify that there was a mandatory site briefing as part of the tender tender package. We had 13 contractors show up and only one out of those chose to submit. We are chasing up with some of the contractors as to understand why they were not willing to submit a tender, and hopefully we'll have that information for you at council.
Councillors, Manager, just in relation to the scoring at 68%, and ordinarily would see things in sort of 70s, 80s. So you're still satisfied that this will be a job well done?
Yes, we have followed up with recent references and they are more than capable of doing the work and meeting the specification that was put out.
Okay, thank you. Any final questions on the tender? Thank you very much, Manager. We're moving on from infrastructure and environment to community and business services. Item 7.1, financial statements as at the 31st of January 2023. Any questions? Okay, 7.2, authorisation of expenditure for the period 1st of January to 31st of January 2023. 7.3, investment report as at 31st of January 2023. Any questions? Item 7.4, mid-year budget review 2022-23. There was a briefing on this at the workshop, but are there any additional questions? Councillor Oaklow.
Thanks, Mayor. I just want to clarify when it refers to mid-year budget review, are we literally saying that it's as at 31 December?
Through you, Mayor Cole, this is based on 31 January data.
Is there any evidence between now and 31 January that there's been any other projects that may be subject to slippage?
Through you, Mayor Cole, this is based on our assessment at the time. Obviously, the mid-year budget process takes a number of weeks to complete. So as at that point in time, this is our best case estimate. There potentially could be other items in the last couple of weeks, which we haven't factored in as part of this review.
So as at 31 January, as far as we're aware, so 7 months into the year, what administration, just to confirm what administration is saying, is that effectively 3.5 million of the original $20 million CapEx won't be spent in FY23 as previously forecast.
Through you, Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct. We've essentially for those projects, for various reasons, they will not physically be spent in this financial year. It could be procurement or other reasons, but anticipating the funds will be spent in FY24 instead.
Okay, that was another question. So it's definitely timing and it's not a permanent difference. You're just saying it's slippage into the next financial year.
Through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct. So one of the projects is the Leederville Oval Lights. Obviously, there's still probably a number of things to go on there, but we're forecasting that will be spent in FY24 as well at this stage. But all the other ones, there's some light sort of fleet vehicles as well, which with the long lead times, they should be procured in FY24 as well.
And just specifically as to the reasons why we weren't able to forecast these particular slippages, have you got a generic answer as to what has happened as to why we didn't predict that they would flow into the following year?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole. So the challenge we have in local government is we can't actually commence a project without budget there. So we physically wouldn't be able to order the vehicles unless we had an approved budget. So from time to time, there could be slippages in the following year, but with the procurement timelines to physically be able to order something, we need budget. So it is one of the sort of restrictions in local government.
I didn't understand that. I'll just rephrase the question. It was, what's the high level reason why the capital work slipped and that we couldn't forecast it?
Through you, Mayor Cole. So at the time of preparing this budget, administration were of the view that all these projects could be delivered within the year. As we go through the year and we go through procurement and very other priorities sometimes take precedence, we reassess and we adjust our budget accordingly during the year. So the mid-year budget review is a chance for us to sort of pivot and reassess where the priorities are and what a realistic estimation is to complete the year at.
Okay, so you're saying forecasting risk and that there was some reprioritisation.
Through you, Mayor Cole. Yes, that's correct.
What proportion of the 3.5 million over budget of capital spend was funded through municipal funds, like funded by ratepayers in the last rates as at 1 July?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Coles. So in attachment 5, we provide that information. So essentially the amount there for 950,000 transferred to reserves. Those are funds we've collected through municipal funds, and we're going to put them aside and spend them in the following financial year. The other sort of 4 columns there are essentially funds that were either coming out of reserves or grants and contributions or proceeds from disposals we haven't received yet, but we forecast to receive them in the following year.
Okay, so 950,000 was funded through municipal funds out of the 3.5. Thanks for clarifying. Is that roughly about, if I get my math right, can you just confirm that that relates to roughly, it's 350,000 is 1% rate increase, isn't it? So it's roughly 3% of the rate increase of the 7.6 that we charge. It's roughly 3% of that rate increase.
Through Michael, yeah, approximately. On the current rate base, it'd be about 2.5%, but as at the time of preparing the budget, it would have been closer to 3.
Given that these delay to capital expenditure is pushing into FY24 and we still need to do it, what's the logic of administration wanting to redirect these funds for different purposes, specifically 1.5 million into underground power and 1.25 for Tamala Park reserves?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Coles. So the 1.25 Tamala Park reserve, that's essentially putting it back into reserve. So at the first quarter budget review, we pulled them out of reserve to put them in our municipal funds. In case City of Perth did sell their share, we had to buy back into it. So this is just reversing what we had in the original budget. So there's actually no net change there within the year. Underground power is our priority for the city over the next sort of 5 to 10 years. So we're doing everything we can to be able to put ourselves in a position to provide ratepayers longer payback periods. There was a number of sort of operational savings and additional revenue through the mid-year budget review, and we decided to start to build that underground power reserve to be able to actually borrow enough to provide ratepayers with longer payback periods.
I understand so the 1.25 for Tamala Park, you're saying that's just a reversal of a reserve, doesn't form part of the 3.5 million reduction. That's correct?
Yes,
okay.
It was sitting in muni funds
Thank
in
you.
the first quarter review.
Okay, great. So, but in relation to the other amounts that's moving to reserves, like for the underground power, if you're saying that this spend on deferred capital works will need to be done in FY24, you're effectively like, I don't understand why you're pushing it to underground power when you're saying that the work has to be done anyway.
Yeah, through you, Michael, we've essentially put enough into reserve for those projects we've deferred. So this is over and above that. So essentially, we had an opening surplus. We've got some additional interest revenue on our sort of investments. There's some additional parking revenue as well. So those additional revenues, we've decided to put those into reserve over and above the budget. So this is nothing that was budgeted originally. This is a favourable position halfway through the year that we identified, and we've redirected those funds into reserve for the use of underground power in the future.
I'm not following, sorry. So the 3.5 million over budget, we're saying we're going to do those works in 2024. And so my question is, where is the 1.5 million coming from underground power? Are you saying it's coming from additional revenue and not from the capital works?
Yeah, through email, Carl, that's correct. Yeah, so if you have a look at attachment 5, the 3.1 million in carry forward assets, we've sort of accounted for where that's coming from and going to. So 950, we've put aside for that to be spent next year. The underground power reserve money is purely just predominantly from a favourable operating result for FY23. $750,000 relates to interest revenue due to higher interest rates. There's some additional parking revenue as well. And we obviously had an opening surplus as well. At the beginning of the year, over and above what we budgeted to start the year at, and that related to probably, without checking off the top of my head, operational savings from FY22 as well.
The 3 million on attachment 5, 3.1 million, which would have otherwise been carry forward capital works into the opening balance. It does say that has all been accounted for here. But I might just come back with a question during the week or next week, if that's okay. Yep.
Through you, Michael, yes, happy to take questions later on.
If oh, sorry, one or two. If in relation to the underground power, and I think Dudley asked a question in question time. If we haven't worked out what the funding model is for underground power, and the funding model being what is the way in which we can help certain ratepayers pay back effectively pay back the charges for underground power down the line, 3 or 4 years down the track. Do you think why is it appropriate that we allocate 1.5 million now into this reserve before we've actually done the work on the funding model?
Through you, Michael, we have done a lot of work on the funding model as presented to council at the budget workshop last month. What we do know is we can't physically borrow 100% of the projects. So to be able to provide longer payback periods, we do need some money in reserves, and that's just the reality. So we'd love to be able to borrow 100%, but the speed at which we're having to roll underground power at the city, given the age of the infrastructure, all coming up for renewal at a similar time, means the city's ability to borrow is constrained. So we will need additional reserves. We are modelling what those reserves are and what those payback periods are, but we are fairly well progressed with that modelling at this stage.
But council at that workshop didn't council at that workshop say that some of the assumptions of the modelling that was presented could be challenged, i.e. 70% of ratepayers may want to access this funding model, and also ideas as to whether third parties could fund the loan. So my understanding was that the modelling was still to come back to council. It was still a work in progress, and because it was a work in progress, I'm wondering whether it's appropriate that at this point in time we allocate 1.5 into a reserve when, again, I'm wondering whether, in your view, do you think that's not premature?
Through you, Michael, no, we don't. Essentially, the 5 scenarios we presented previously, the scenarios that council were in favour of, we couldn't fund based on that scenario modelling. So with the 1.5, it does make it easier for us to make the scenarios work, and we'll have some more information in a couple of weeks. But in short answer, we will need additional reserves to be able to make a faster rollout of underground power work.
And lastly, this is all about over budgeting CapEx. But why not leave this the amount that we received from municipal funds from ratepayers because of an over budget? Why not leave it in the opening carry forward for capital works, so that the effect of doing that, as opposed to what you're doing here, as I could see, is that the ratepayers would pay less next year for when we come to do our budget? Because if it's remained in the opening capital works carry forward, then it would be to the benefit of ratepayers. They would be paying less for rates next year. But by moving it in the way that you're doing it here, you're effectively banking that money, and it doesn't carry forward in the opening carry forward capital works balance.
Through you, Michael, just to clarify, are you referring to the 950 the transfer to reserve in the muni funds, or are we talking about the 1.5 million underground power amount? Which one are we discussing?
I care about the $1 million that was raised from municipal funds. So I'm presuming is that not going into the underground power?
No, through you, Michael, that's going into the asset sustainability reserve.
Yep. And
that will be accessed next year. So ratepayers won't get rated again for that. We're essentially quarantining that money, and we're saying we will spend it next year. We've collected it this year, and we'll commit to those projects, and we'll deliver them the following year. So no, we will not be rating again. If it's sat in surplus, it's exactly the same result, because then we'll just take out a surplus in the following budget year. But we're actually restricting the use of those funds to reserves to only be spent on those projects in FY24.
But correct me if I'm wrong, the difference though is if it's in the carry forward opening balance, it 100% will reduce the amount that ratepayers have to pay. If it goes to reserves, be it an asset sustainability reserve, then that's it to administration's discretion as to whether it's spent and used and drawn out of reserves to any capital works that are budgeted for FY24. So it's not a guarantee.
Through you, Michael, the only way it would benefit ratepayers is if council decided not to proceed with these projects. So that's the only way the funds would then be able to be used for something else to ultimately reduce the sort of rate increase. In this instance, if we are going to proceed with these projects, we are essentially putting that money aside. It's notionally like it's sitting in surplus, but all it does it restricts those funds, so we can only use them for these particular projects and nothing else.
That last question. If there is amount sitting in any type of reserve and there is something in a capital works budget, so if for FY24 that relates to that item, is it 100% required of administration to finance that asset capital works from reserves first, as opposed to municipal funds in the following year?
Through you, Mayor Cole, if reserve funds have been allocated to a project, they will be spent on that project. A lot of the time it's a combination of both, but if we put aside $500,000 for a particular project in reserve, we will spend that for that project. If there is a change to that, we'll come back to council through a budget review and seek approval for an adjustment. But as it stands now, these funds have been quarantined for these projects to be delivered next financial year.
Can I just clarify, Mayor Cole? I think it's just important to note that money can't be spent out of the reserve by administration unless council adopts a budget that states that that amount of money needs to come out of reserve for that project. So administration can't access reserves only unless council has adopted use of those reserve funds for a specific project. So council's the one that makes the decision about use of all reserve funds.
So it's not guaranteed. It's subject to council approval. Thank you.
We've given an undertaking. I think that's the point. The undertaking is made that you have a mid-year review, you say, on the basis of administration saying that this, for whatever reason, won't be spent. It could potentially be procured. That process can start because funding is there. But the pact that you have is that when you're doing these, making these decisions about funds being transferred to the Asset Sustainability Reserve, that funding will come out next year for that project.
My point being that you can change that. You can move it from one, like we have here. We allocated costs for a particular reason and we're moving
No, I
it to a
get that, but I
different
think
purpose.
that goes to intent, and I don't think that reflects the intent of this council. So I just wanted to clarify that.
The intent not to change but we're doing it here. That's all.
I feel that the questions have been answered very well by our CFO, and it's about a timing and a preservation of those funds in the Asset Sustainability Reserve for that purpose. Councillor Loden.
I just had a query around the Beatty Park change rooms. So we've gone from a budget this year of 850 to, if I'm reading correctly, the budget will be that come back in our next budget is $1.2 million for that. Have I got that correct?
Through you, Mayor Cole. So I think what has been disclosed here, essentially the current estimates are 915,000. We have 650 in the current budget, which we're putting to next year. In the current version of the 4-year capital works plan, there are sort of two items for the change rooms because it's such a large amount. It was spread over the 2 years, two sort of separate periods in the 4-year plan. I think the initial estimates were it was going to be 1.2, so which is why we have provision for that amount of funds. At this stage, it's looking more like 900,000. So what's written here is essentially saying the project will take probably more than a year and be spread over 2 financial years in the 4-year plan.
So maybe to put it another way, we put 850 in this year. And if we approved budgets more than 1 year, if hypothetically we'd put a plan in for next year, we would, complete that project, we'd put effectively $350,000 in that. We're pulling some of the money out of, we're pulling a bunch of the money out of that and putting it all, and we're going to deliver it all next year, effectively. But we need to top it up a little bit because of the funds that we're using for the tiling that we're bringing forward.
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole, that's correct. Just so the current timing is it'll be delivered across FY24 and 25. So 650 is being put in reserve for that into 24, and we would seek some additional funds through the 4-year plan to be able to fund the remaining portion in FY25. But yes, that's correct.
And just from a process point of view, I know we've got in it, I think it's attachment 7, the change request is attached to this report. So is that effectively council's approval of the change of that project?
Through your Mayor Cole, yes, that's correct. So that's come up with the mid-year budget review as well, because there has been a delay to that project and there is a change in budget. So essentially, council is approving that, but it is obviously still subject to us having the funds within the development of the FY24 budget as well.
So we'll effectively reconsider it next year anyway, when we get to that budgeting process. Thank you.
Councillors, any further questions on mid-year review? Thank you very much, CFO. Okay, that takes us to Chief Executive Officer items. So 8.1, City of Vincent ordinary election of the 21st of October 2023, appointment of electoral commissioner to conduct the election by postal vote. Any questions? 8.2, advertising of amended policy, legal representation for council members and employees. Councillor Iapolo.
Yeah, just in relation to the change made in the preamble to the policy, it's indicated that the Local Government Act protects both employees and councillors. I'm coming with a question for anything that's done in good faith. As long as they've acted in good faith, the Local Government Act protects it. Why do we need this policy as a result of that?
Through Mayor Cole. So the department has given some advice about enshrining that provision and ensuring that you have clear protections available to staff and elected members about what our obligations are as a duty of care. So while the Act does provide an overarching statement, it's necessary to have some clear guidance about what our position is and how someone would be able to access those protections in the instance that they were facing a legal claim.
So I guess my question is, if the Local Government Act provides a protection under 9.56, and this policy is giving now, through the changes, the CEO's ability to approve for legal representation costs, particularly for employees, I think council will still need to approve council legal fees. How do they work? Like, if there's a decision from a City of Vincent's point of view that the legal fees won't be covered, but the Act under 9.56 allows for that protection where it's in good faith. So the only difference I can see, and I want you to confirm this, please, is that this policy allows the City of Vincent to pay for legal representation costs for either employees or councillors when they're acting not in good faith.
Through the chair. So basically the Act provides a head of power for setting out that staff and elected members are protected from wrongs, from being prosecuted for wrongs where they've acted in good faith. That's just sort of a blanket statement. This then provides a pathway for how we would consider, or what measures we would consider if someone was faced with an instance where they're accused of being in the wrong. So I guess that's two parts. Then in terms of the responsibilities of the council or the CEO is to undertake that assessment of whether or not someone is being wrongfully prosecuted for something that they did in the line of their work that was in good faith. Then the CEO can provide that we would cover the legal expenses. But in the instance where the CEO resolves not to support that, it would typically be where they've not acted in good faith.
But how can the CEO be in a position to make that adjudication when it's subject to a proceeding in court? So the court will ultimately decide whether, in fact, someone actually acted in good faith or not. How is it that this policy requires the CEO to make a decision ahead of time? How can he or she make that determination when it is ultimately subject to the court?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Happy to take it on notice if you like.
Through Mayor Cole, in the scenario you're describing, if I or another manager thought an employee wasn't acting in good faith, they nearly certainly would have breached the code of conduct. So they'd already been investigated for breaching the city's code of conduct, and the same would apply for a council member. If a council member wasn't acting in good faith, they're likely to be subject to a complaint under the code of conduct, which is a separate issue to this legal proceedings policy.
And through Mayor Cole, if I just might add, I think there's two separate things here. So the Act, provides a very clear protection for council members. It doesn't give council members a right to have legal fees or advice. It just provides a protection. So it doesn't mean that local governments would pay an individual council member's legal fees. The policy is what what creates that and enables that. So there's no obligation for local governments to pay the legal fees unless the council's decided that they have a policy or an approach to do that. So all the Local Government Act does is provide a protection, so that when you end up in court paying your legal fees, whether they're being paid for by the local government or by yourself, you can use that as a defence.
So what does 9.56 protect then? That if it's not legal fees, then what are you saying? If there's a case for damages,
correct?
But that's only if you're guilty,
correct?
But then if you're guilty you would be not acting in good faith. So I'm confused because this is saying that 9.56 only covers you when you're acting in good faith.
Correct, that's right. So the legal fees would only be paid for by the city where you've been acting in good faith, and then you can, use those legal fees to pay for a legal defence on the basis that you've been acting in good faith, and therefore you're protected by the Act.
Can I just get some notes in the briefing notes rather than continue to ask questions that specifically addresses how is it that this policy, which is at some discretion of either council or the CEO, how can this policy potentially deny a request for legal fees when the local act specifically says that there is some protections when someone's acting in good faith?
Through Mayor Cole, just to clarify, we wouldn't deny an employee legal representation if they're acting in good faith in the course of their duties.
The court's going to decide that. That's my point. I mean, I don't know how. Are you saying that this policy would work with a condition to say if the court upheld our view that the person was acting in good faith, that then therefore only on that basis will we reimburse any legal fees?
Through Mayor Cole, just to clarify that if we thought an employer wasn't acting in good faith, they probably would have already gone through a code of conduct process and they may no longer be an employee of the City of Vincent.
Does this policy actually require a referral to a code of conduct? Because you're assuming that someone actually going to make to raise an issue to the City of Vincent over a course of because of the code of conduct. They wouldn't have to do that. They could just decide to take legal action.
Through you, Mayor Cole, no, the code of conduct's an internal document. So that was if we conducted an investigation, an employer had breached the code of conduct because they weren't conducting their duties in accordance with that code of conduct and they weren't acting in good faith, depending on the severity of the breach of the code of conduct, they may or may not still be an employee of the City of Vincent. If they were no longer an employee and they were found to have breached the code of conduct, they might be subject to legal proceedings if they'd committed something within a third party. That would no longer be may no longer be an issue for us.
Okay, if you could add to the briefing notes the clarification that in the event that the city determines by review of the code of conduct that there's nothing, that the person has acted in good faith, that if there is a court case that happens and proceedings are taken against either an employer or a councillor, and it's proven that they acted in good faith or that one of those people acted in bad faith and you didn't adjudicate that this policy in retrospect would still cover the person.
Through you, Mayor Cole, if the city was going to essentially fund legal proceedings, we'd be doing so on the basis that we thought we had an argument and a case.
But my question, David, is if you get that wrong and the court takes a different view.
Can I just say, I feel we're going around in circles here. But
someone's answering the question.
Councillor Uplow has requested for this to be dealt with in the briefing notes. Does administration feel they have sufficient information about the question to be able to provide the response?
Yes, I'm clear on what you're asking and we'll seek to provide that.
Okay. Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. I really was just going to add that perhaps those notes could clarify the distinction between there's two different legal tests here. There's the test that the city will undertake as to what is in good faith. The CEO's just said that's in the performance of their duties as defined by the city. There's probably some case law on the legislation, but that may well be a completely different legal test to what the court case relates to, might have absolutely nothing to do with the two. And I don't think that we should get too confused between the two different tests.
Councillor Konchevsky.
Thank you. My question just relates to the removal of the section around repayment of legal fees that have been funded by the city. As to what the intention was behind removing that section.
Through the chair. So what's intended is that we've removed those clauses 3.5, 3.6 and 7 that require repayment of legal costs, and these are going to be assessed and determined on a case-by-case basis. And so we've amended 5.1 and 5.2 to include that it can be granted, it can be refused, or it can be granted with conditions, and a condition could require the repayment of legal fees.
Okay, but if it was council's intent that that the legal fees should be repaid where like in particular circumstances, then that would require an amendment. So that it was to make that clear within the policy.
Through the chair, I believe that, say for instance, you wanted to say the fees, legal fees would be refunded subject to the matter being dismissed or something like that, then you could have those limitations already in the approval conditions.
But the approval conditions aren't approved by council, are they? We just approve a policy that provides direction to administration on what they might include in conditions.
Yes, but the intention of the policy review is to remove council's input into the staff member decision-making element. Council would still have control over any requests made by elected members. So the responsibility for determining the conditions and those would fall to the CEO for all staff members. And if it came down to a matter of budget and things like that, then separate arrangements could be made to present that. But what we're trying to really differentiate here is that the staff are the responsibility of the CEO, and he would be responsible for imposing any conditions and making decisions around that. And any matters related to elected members or the CEO would come to the council.
Okay, but clause 7 relates to council members and staff. So, and I guess that was my other question in relation to this. So I'm assuming that on implementing this policy, then in effect, council is giving the CEO authority to waive legal fees up to the value of his financial delegated authority in terms of that 250 threshold, subject to budget within that particular line item. Kind of just that is correct, yes?
Yes.
And if the so I guess on that, if I could just just confirmation of the extent to which council has approved waiving of legal fees in recent times, and I guess an indication of how far 250k might get us, or what our current budget is for legal fees, etc. Yeah, I don't have an issue with the CEO taking responsibility for that side of operations. I think I'm unsure that that 7 is reasonably and fully covered by 5.1 and 5.2, but I'll have a think about that during the week. But thank you very much for that information.
Through Mayor Cole, I think this issue in terms of the policy, it's only ever come up once before my time. I think it was related to a building compliance dispute. Not sure if the executive director was still here when that happened. It was before. So it was about 10 years ago, a long time ago. We've never needed the policy to that extent. The city has standing, and you'll see in the budget that we have legal expenses for property matters, land matters, planning matters, and HR, and then general legal matters as well. And we tend to go to different external lawyers under each of those 4 categories of legal advice that we might require.
Can I just say though, that on that line of questioning, it does raise the issue of whether the policy should at least countenance the idea of repayment and in what circumstances, because that's been wholeheartedly removed from the policy. So if administration could potentially consider what would happen in the case where costs were awarded and covered legal fees, or if there is a finding against the employee or councillor,
Yes,
should those costs not be repaid?
Yeah, through you, Mayor Cole. I mean, that's the intent, but we'll have a look at whether any of that could sit under 5.3. That might make sense. So we'll have a look at that during the week.
Thank you very much. Any further questions? Okay. Next is item 8.3, local government statutory compliance audit return 2022. Any questions? And 8.5, financial year 22 Australasian Local Government Performance Excellence Program key findings of benchmarking report. Councillor Hallett.
Thank you, through the Mayor to the CEO. I'm just wondering what actions are being taken to address the overtime issue.
Through Mayor Cole, that has come up over the previous reports as well, and mainly relates to infrastructure and environment. And it does tend to relate largely to extended out of normal hours in parks and also engineering, and a lot of other night works for roads and weekend work as well. So I have asked the acting executive director to look at that, just to make sure that it's not creating the risk of unsafe work practices through fatigue or other ways that we might be managing our workforce. There is another finding related to the fact that we do have, proportionally compared to the benchmark councils, a very low agency spend. So it seems that we're using our own staff to perform overtime during outside normal business hours, night works and weekends, as opposed to contracting agency staff. And I couldn't tell you right now whether or not it's more expensive to pay our staff overtime to work on weekends at night, or to pay the higher cost of an agency staff member to do that. But I think this has been a long-standing practice, as far as I can tell from the last 3 reports. We're looking at that mainly through an OSH risk perspective, in terms of what hours staff might be working, whether there's a fatigue issue potentially involved.
Councillors, Councillor Castle.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick question. I'm happy to be taken on notice. The road operating expense that's double the metro median, does this relate to the ratio, whose name I've forgotten, that we were highly underspending on in previous years? And does that mean we have overcorrected? Or does that simply represent the getting back on track?
It's a different metric. The finding is that per kilometre, City of Vincent's very high. The previous finding that we had discussions with the Federal Department of Transport was around our own source spending on roads compared to the federal grant spending, and that was just how much the split between municipal funding and grant funding, and that was creating an issue with the ratio and the grant requirements. This figure, which is very large, relates largely to the point I just made around being in an inner city. For every 1 kilometre of road resurfacing, we usually have to do it at night, and it's going to be double the cost of outer suburban areas due to traffic management costs. And I think traffic management costs kill us in just about every aspect of roads, and trying to avoid busy inner city roads for closures during the day.
Councillors, any further questions on this item? Okay, that concludes the items of business to ask questions on this evening. If I could just remind you of where we started at this evening. We talked about providing any amendments in advance of the meeting, that would be incredibly helpful, particularly on the AGME item. That would be very much appreciated if you could submit by Thursday evening, Friday morning. And there have been a few others flagged this evening, so anything that you can provide in advance would help for an efficient meeting. It is a relatively large agenda, so that would be very much appreciated. And yes.
When would the briefing notes be received if you want the changes by Thursday?
Through Mayor Cole, so we'll release the final agenda. We'll also have to upload the audit committee minutes, which won't go out until this week as well. So on Friday, we'll send out the final OCM agenda with the briefing notes. If there's a particular issue on any of those items that you're thinking that you might like to move an amendment on, which you're flagged, if you could highlight those. If you could highlight those now, then we could help prepare the draft amendments, and then that would require separate reasoning as well, which we might use some of the information we're already putting together on the briefing notes. So happy to have an advanced meeting or provide the briefing note responses separately to a councillor if it's looking like there might be an amendment on the table, which we'd like to prepare before the end of the week.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I declare the meeting close at 8:58 p.m.